Friends, very good to have you join us. James, very good to see you.
Lovely to see you too, Ian, back in Blighty.
Thank you very much. Yes, I've been traveling and you're about to travel as well, aren't you? You're going off on the Camino
I am. I'm walking a week of the Camino to Santiago. Yeah. So
in
that's
northern Spain.
in
So
northern Spain. Yeah.
you'll come back fit, suntanned, and spiritually renewed.
Well, I don't think the suntan because the weather forecast is terrible. But hopefully spiritually renewed and
You come,
possibly fit.
you come back well watered. So that's great.
I hope so.
Now, James, where are we in the lectionary now?
We are in Easter 6 Sunday of Easter, so rapidly pedaling onwards to towards Pentecost.
Yep.
And John 15, 9 to 17. So the passage which follows on from last week's passage. We read the first part of John 15 last week.
Yeah, second half really, isn't it? Of the
Yeah, it is really.
yeah.
But a significant sort of shift in subject really and interest with some continuity, but quite a
Mm.
significant breakpoint, as it were.
So just a reminder, useful to have your Bible in front of you or a text, however you
Yeah.
look at it, just so that you can follow, because we'll do a bit of comparison between last week's and this week's as well. And that's a reminder to do other things too, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So do click like on our videos. That would be really great. Do subscribe to the channel if you haven't. You'll get notifications. Do share on the social media.
On the
That would be
social media,
lovely.
yeah.
And do comment on the YouTube channel or on the
On
social media or wherever you come across this video.
And we had some lovely comments last week, actually, didn't we? So thank you very much.
We really did. It was very, very kind of people.
Very encouraging. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great encouragement. Yeah, thank you for your ministry of encouragement, everybody. Yeah.
Now, a couple of things connecting with last week, which is that, and some people enjoyed this. I shared two photos of my vine.
Yes.
And I showed it in a prune state and in a beginning to produce leaves, not quite fruitful state yet.
Yes.
But the really interesting thing is that since the last video, in about a week's growth, I just popped in earlier today and looked at my vine, and it's looking very different because we've got a lot more growth, and we're just getting the flowers at on the stems, which will turn into the grapes. And that means that once those flowers have set, I need to do that spring pruning where we take away the leaves, which are nice and look good, and you need some leaves there. But the danger is the plant puts its energy into the leaves instead of into the fruit production.
Yeah.
So it's this idea of pruning away things which are good in themselves, but actually can be a distraction from the thing which is best, which we're really looking for, which is the
yes. Yes. Well, there we are. That's interesting. We might reflect further on that.
Yeah, we might well do. I was again struck by the fact that the word, we did mention this, but I've continued to be impressed by it, the fact that the word for pruning in Greek is the same word as the word for cleaning. And I just noticed again, going back over the passage, that we're misled a little bit in some English translations. I'm looking at the ESV. Interestingly, I'm surprised the ESV does this, which says that you are already clean in verse 3 because of the word, and you miss the connection with, Jesus says, I'm going to prune you. You're already pruned by my words.
Yes. Yes.
I think that connection with the word of Jesus is going to become important in this second half as well, isn't it?
Yes, I think it is. Yeah.
Well, should we just step it? It's curious as well that the lectionary splits the reading at verse 9.
Yeah.
Not all English translations break it there, do they?
No, I mean, New Revised Standard Version breaks after 11.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is odd, and yet I think to some extent the lectionary might be onto something here, because I think, as we will show, there is a shift in language at verse 9 as we move away from the vine as the sort of dominant metaphor, into some other language. So that's quite interesting, isn't it?
Well, should we have a look at that? I'll just
yes, that would be
table
helpful
here, which we'll share. And just so that everyone can see, this is just a table really where I've summarized the ideas and the structure of the two halves of this section of the chapter. It's not the whole chapter, actually, is it? Because the chapter goes on and on and on. It's quite a lot more. But these are the two readings that we had. The one last week from 1 to 8. And then this week's from 9 to 17. And the way I've constructed this is simply to put the key ideas in bold, but when they're just in bold, straightforward bold, non-italic, that's when the idea is introduced. And then bold italic is when the idea is returned to again.
Yeah.
So in the first column, last week's reading, we've got Jesus, the true vine. That's obviously a major idea that's introduced there.
Yeah.
And his father is the gardener, or the vine
Vine
dresser,
dresser.
or the
Yeah.
worker in the worker in the vine. And then we had that debate last week, didn't we, about whether this is a vine or whether it's actually a vineyard.
Yes, and exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
That was from David Paul's commentary, and the fact that if Jesus is a vineyard, if that word amphalos actually means vineyard rather than vine, that makes more sense of the metaphor, but it also makes more sense of the connections with the Old Testament, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, because of those references to the vineyard of the Lord. Yeah.
Yeah.
Israel. Yeah.
But you can see the way that this sort of Jesus speech here sort of circles around those ideas, can't you? Because you get the vine and the gardener, then you get the instruction of pruning and fruitfulness, and then we return to the idea of pruning,
Yeah.
and then we get the introduction of Jesus's teaching, and then we get a new idea of abiding,
Yes.
and then we return to the idea of fruit, and then we go back to the idea of vine, and then we get vining, the vine and abiding and fruit, and then a repeat of Jesus's teaching, and then you begin a new idea here about asking. Whatever you ask for, it'll be given to you.
Yeah.
Then again, you get the instruction of glory, and then you go back to fruit, and then you get the mention of disciples. So in last week's reading, you get, again, you can see this sort of circling around, and each time we go around, we get a new idea fed in.
Yeah.
And then now we come to this week's reading, starting at verse 9, and we got another whole new set of ideas introduced, don't we? Which does make the break make sense.
It absolutely, because suddenly we're into the language of love and commandment and obedience, as it were, joy, friendship, and so on. And then we do go back to bearing fruit and abiding at the end. But as you say, it's kind of like we're circling around again, but new words are being folded in, and original words are fading into the background, and the metaphor of the vine fades into the background quite significantly, I think.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
In this second part. So yeah, it's an interesting shift.
One of the things that strikes me just looking at this pattern in that second column is you've got loving being folded into abiding, and abiding in love. So we were abiding in Jesus, and now we're abiding in his love.
Yes.
And then you get the idea of commands folding. I've almost got an image of somebody mixing a cake in a bowl, and you're stirring it around, and then you add another ingredient, and it adds a sort of new color to the mixture.
Yeah.
And then gradually that gets included. And then you put another ingredient in, and they get I want to use these visual metaphors. But it's striking in verse 17 that you almost get and I don't know if commentators mention this, where anyone should propose this, you're almost getting a kind of inclusio in this bit, because you started with love and abiding and then the commands, and then you go back to, at the end, the commands and love, and you just talked about abiding.
Yes. It does feel a little bit like that, doesn't it? It's not overly structured, but it does feel like there is that's like is going on.
Yeah. Just in column 1, actually, you've got fruitfulness quite near the beginning, and then you've got the language of bearing fruit near the end as well.
Yeah, exactly.
The other metaphor, visual way of picturing this is I've found quite interesting, especially if I haven't done enough pruning on my vine. If you don't prune the leaves off once the fruit begins to set, once the flowers begin to get fertilized and you can see them beginning to grow, the other thing you have to prune off actually is the tendrils, because the vine's constantly reaching out and grabbing onto other stuff. If you have another plant nearby, it'll be grabbed as well. And that's the other sort of picture I have here, which is that this passage is almost like it's got little tendrils going out, and they sort of grab onto these other ideas. So in fact, this language here, it reaches from ideas from all over the gospel, because of course the whole idea of abiding is one we've seen right from the very beginning, when the disciples say to Jesus, well, where do you stay? So there's a little tendril there reaching out to that. And then you got the mention of glory as well. And of course, people talk about the second half of this fourth gospel as being a sort of book of glory. We saw in chapter 12, that this is the time when this is the hour has come, and when God will glorify his name through Jesus.
Yes, and of course, as we often said when we look at the prologue, I mean, these are ideas which the prologue has told us are coming. The first chapter of John is coming. Glory is of the Father's only Son, and all of that. So this is just picking up those ideas now and exploring them in new ways.
And weaving them together. That does, unlike sort of Pauline text. In fact, unlike we as when we were dealing with Mark's gospel, it's quite hard to talk about this passage or even to preach on it in a very systematic way, verse to verse by verse. If you do that, you end up sort of circling around back again. So,
Yeah, I think this probably is a passage where you could just focus on one idea as you work your way through it,
yeah,
on abiding or on commandment
yeah,
or
yeah.
joy or whatever. And I think I think passages like this in John, you do really have to decide, okay, so what am I, you know, going to
Mm.
talk about, rather than just simply going through and expounding, as it were.
Yeah, yeah. Although I think, and we'll come back to this. It seems to me as well that the one of the parts of the power of this passage is in the way that different ideas are connected,
Yeah, absolutely,
and that
absolutely.
changes the way that we perceive them. So,
Yes, yes.
okay, well, let's carry on through and see how we how we uh, deal with these ideas. So we're studying verse 9. And this verse 9 raises something very pressing for me. As the Father has loved me, so I've loved you. Abide in my love. And those with a sort of theological inclination might immediately reach for this phrase of the perichoretic dance of Trinitarian relationships into which we are drawn, which
Yeah.
is language that I do not like very much. And so I'm glad it brought a smile to your face. And I don't think it's just prejudice on my part. I think there's a tendency to pick up these trendy ideas and not really think critically about them.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to pause and think, well, what is actually being said here, and are these things, as it were, um, are they echoed elsewhere in the Gospels? I mean, that's
Mm,
a really important idea,
yeah.
isn't it?
I probably ought to explain the idea that I don't like. So,
Yes, you probably should actually. Go on,
so yeah,
get it out of your system.
well, this is the idea that the three persons of the Trinity are in this sort of dance of love, and that Jesus' language of love here is about us being drawn into this dance. And the difficulty I think with it is that, well, the textual difficulty is I find it very striking that Jesus never says, "Love me as I love the Father,"
No, no,
or "Love one another." He never says, "Love one another as the Father loves me." He says, "Love one
no.
another as I've loved you."
Yes,
And that points to the fact that the persons of the Trinity are not persons in the way that you and I are persons.
no, no.
You and I, despite appearances, you and I do have separate centers of will. Therefore, it's
Yes,
possible for us to disagree with one another.
yeah,
And therefore, the love that we would have for one another is a different kind of love than the love of the Father or the Son, because the Father and the Son are not distinct persons. They do have one, they will with one will. So there is an over. I mean, there's no doubt there's no connection. There's a connection. There's an overflow of love between the persons of the Trinity and the love that God has for the world and that Jesus has for his disciples.
yes,
But it's not the same. And actually, when we go through the passage, we see that because there isn't the symmetry between
no,
us and Jesus that there
no.
is between the persons of the Trinity. Because apart from anything else, when we love Jesus, we obey him.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, that's immediately what verse 10 goes on to explore, isn't it? And
Yeah.
explain, really. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. And that's,
But
I think it's,
this means that the kind of love he's talking about is something quite different from sort of
yes,
romantic love or emotional love or just sort of.
yeah,
I mean, how do we make sense of the fact that yes, we feel that God has set his love on us, but actually abiding in his love cannot be separated from obeying his commandments? There's
yeah.
something going on there. Is there something quite different going on there?
I think so. I mean, love and commandment are really completely bound up in one another. And in a sense, the obedience is celebrating the abiding, isn't it? It's the evidence of abiding, and it's and in that sense, it's very deeply, I think, connected with the Old Testament law as well, isn't it? With passages like in Deuteronomy 6, where you have the love and the commandment are bound up in this idea of daily abiding.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
what is it that Deuteronomy 6 says something like, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Keep these words that I'm commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you're at home, when you're away, when you lie down, and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as
Yes.
an emblem on your forehead.
Yes.
So that's very much Jesus is very much almost sort of riffing on this here, isn't he? I think
Yeah, yeah,
there's a very much a sense in which what he's saying here is consistent, except it's also explained personally in
yeah,
a way that
yeah.
it hasn't been in quite the same way in the Old Testament.
Well, it's relationally, isn't it?
Absolutely relationally. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
obedience is an expression of the relational love.
Yeah.
I mean, I would go on, just going back to Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, I would say
Mm.
it's even more strong than that, because it, of course, it begins with, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord
Yes.
our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart." Now, the language of hearing in the Old Testament is obedience language. It's not just,
Yes.
this is what,
No, it's hearken, isn't
you
it?
know,
In King James, it's hearken, which
do,
means do what you.
do this. Yeah. Yeah,
Yes, do this. Yeah,
yeah,
do what you're
exactly. So.
told. Yeah.
Now, again, this is the difficulty with going logically through, because immediately we go in verse 11, "These things I've spoken to you, that my joy," there's another new idea,
Yeah.
"my
Suddenly,
joy
yeah.
may be in you, and your joy may be complete."
Mm.
And there's a very important eschatological idea there, because, in Jewish thinking, you'd only have complete joy in the age to come.
Yes.
And in
Yes.
this age, your joy is only complete. And yet, Jesus is saying, actually, if you abide in me and you obey my commandments, which is a way of abiding in my love, your joy will be complete. You're actually stepping into the age to come, which I guess is part of the fourth gospel's realized eschatology.
Exactly. That phrase, realized eschatology, just relentlessly rides over the mountains on this, doesn't it? And
By which we
um,
mean,
by mentioning we participate now in experiencing what is to come at the end.
age
So
to
it's
come. Yeah,
yeah, we glimpse, in a sense, we glimpse it, don't we?
yeah,
And that's true of so much of Christian experience.
yeah.
If someone is healed, that's a glimpse of what is to
Yeah,
come, isn't it?
yeah,
It's the
yeah.
same.
Whereas, I mean, the slight difficulty in the fourth gospel is that the writer is almost careless in saying that, in Jesus' teaching and his actions, the age to come is fully here and fully realized.
Yeah,
Although, when we look at Paul's slightly more theologically nuanced
yeah,
expression of that, we're very clear that we are and we aren't. Although, having said
yeah,
that, in the fourth gospel, Jesus says in chapter 16, "In this world you will have tribulation." So
yeah.
the
It
age to
does.
come isn't yet fully realized in that
No.
sense.
Yeah, yeah. But take heart, I've overcome the world. So it's
Indeed.
so
Yeah.
he got both sides in on that. Yeah,
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 yeah. So fourth gospel is sound after all.
yeah. But
But
there is
having
this
said that,
question.
sorry,
Go
go
on.
on.
Well, there is this question of what love looks like, isn't there? And in relation to obedience and commandment.
Mm,
And I suppose I do. I mean, it's one of the questions I think I have for this passage is whether Jesus is really exhorting the disciples to obedience, or whether he's actually celebrating the joy that comes from obedience. Because if you read it, I think the only exhortation to obedience is in verse 17. Actually, I'm giving you these commands so that you may love one another.
yeah.
But up till that point, it's almost a statement of this is what it looks like.
Mm,
I don't know what you think about that, Ian, but I think it would be quite easy to preach this in a way that says, right, okay, you've all got to be obedient to Jesus, and of course that's absolutely true.
yeah. Yeah.
If we want to love in the way He's calling us to, but it's also where saying, look, this is what love looks like. It's not necessarily how you feel or what a whole load of other
Mm,
ideas about love, which no doubt were around at that
yeah.
time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to go back to, is it Augustine or is it an anecdotal statement of Augustine saying that love Jesus and then do what you want?
Yeah, I can't remember.
Friends, if
Yeah,
you want to
I know the
comment, tell us
phrase.
whether that's a
Yeah,
real quotation, because I'm riffing here. And I suppose my response to you would be, well, it's neither one nor the other, it's both and, because part of the effect of this sort of the idea sort of orbiting round one another is that it does touch on what we said last time, which is that um, vines don't have to sort of go to produce
no,
grapes. If
no,
vines are planted in the right place, if they're fed, if they're pruned, they will produce good fruit, because that's what vines do. So there's a sense in which, Jesus having said, if you're the branch or the individual plant which is planted in the vineyard, and if you allow me to prune you, then, and if you're clean by my word, then you will produce fruit. You don't have to sort of, it's not an effort. And there's a
no.
sense in which the wrapping of the other things in says, well, look, if you are abiding in my love, then you will be obeying my commandments, and obeying my commandments is how you abide in my love. If you love me, you'll do what I say. And
Yeah,
he actually comes back to that in later chapters.
yeah,
And that then the joy that results in that, again, is sort of a natural product of it.
yeah.
And then I think once I think the transition into our relationships with one another is fascinating, because just looking at
Mm.
verse verse 12. This is
Yeah.
my commandment. Well, we don't know what the commandment is. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you,
Yeah.
because we are not the same as Jesus. We are separate persons. He's loved us as an other, and therefore
Yes.
other to one another, we love one another. But then, of course, he goes, greater love has no one than this, and they lay down his life for his friends. Well, of course, that then alludes back to the Good Shepherd,
Yeah.
chapter 10, where
Yeah.
the shepherd lays down his life. So he's then articulating what his love for us looks like, therefore what our love looks like for one another. Therefore, he, in that sort of movement of the spoon stirring the stuff together, he's swirled in another ingredient, which is then say, well, naturally then that expresses itself in love for one another. And of course, that's exactly what 1 John does when it says, no one can say they love God when they don't love
Absolutely.
who they can't see, and love their brother or sister who they can see. So it's
Yeah.
fascinating the way there's a sort of almost a logical shift saying, well, okay, if that's what it looks like, then, if this love that we've seen in Jesus is about loving others, then when we're enfolded in Jesus, when we abide in him, that's the life we're going to have too. And then I think it's fascinating. He then goes on and says, love one another that your joy may be complete.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, this reminds me of a chorus I learned when I was a teenager.
Oh no.
Time for a cue for a song.
You for a song, I know.
Now you know this song, I'm sure, don't you?
I don't know. I don't know what you're going to sing.
This is my commandment, that you love one
Oh yes.
another, that your joy may be full. Yeah?
Yep.
Ring a bell? Okay, fine. But which also has a fascinating psychological dimension to it, because studies of happiness show that the people who are happiest in our world are not the ones who acquire things or do what they want or fulfill their bucket list, but people who are focused on the needs of others, who have a life
Yeah.
that looks outward,
Yeah.
and that the gift of joy and happiness comes, as it were, as a byproduct of being focused on the needs of other people.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's a fascinating kind of psychological dynamic to this as well.
Yes. Yes.
And that then brings us in the whole idea of this shift in register, which again is a related idea, but it's not, doesn't follow logically, as it were. It's like the next adjacent idea that
Yes.
the
Yeah.
shift from being Jesus' servants to being his friends, which is fascinating, isn't it?
It is absolutely fascinating, and it's very interesting. This in my last church, when we introduced common worship, one of the Eucharistic prayers says, Jesus. It talks about Jesus at supper with his friends,
Mm.
and I remember somebody coming up to me and objecting to this,
Oh, right.
finding it far too,
Ali.
far too pally. Yeah, and there's a song, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but which has the line about Jesus, as a children's song, and he's my mate, which is interesting. This chap really objected to this, and I said, well, yeah, it's interesting you object to it, but actually Jesus does call us his friends, and it was quite a revelation really for him.
But isn't there something distinctive here? So on the one hand, I talked earlier about the fact that we got to be careful not to confuse the relationship of love we have with the relationship of love within the persons of the Trinity. We're not just being sucked into this in a kind of social Trinitarian way. On the other hand, it's worth also remembering that friendship was a really important thing in the ancient world. But I think friendship today is always seen as symmetrical.
Yes, it is.
So that if you're friends with me,
So.
I'm friends with you.
Yes.
Now, interestingly, the disciples never called Jesus friend.
No.
And this friendship is one where there is an asymmetry in that we're obedient to Jesus, but he isn't obedient to us.
No. He is always our Lord and Master.
Yeah.
But he calls us his friends. That ought to be transformation enough in terms of how we receive who he is, without us resorting to palliness, which is
but it also means that we obey out of love and understanding, not out of either duty or out of ignorance.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember years ago, before, when I was beginning to explore ordination, the vicar of the church I was at said, well, when God tells you to jump, the only question you ask is how high. But actually, it seems to me this passage says the opposite. So no, hang on. When Jesus, we look all through the scriptures. When Jesus tells Moses to jump, Moses says, "I'm not very good at jumping. My brother's much better at jumping. I am. Why have you asked me anyway?" And actually, God doesn't resent that questioning. So he's not asking us for this kind of mindless, uncomprehending, just do as you're told kind of thing.
No.
But actually, it's a relationship of maturity.
Yeah. Yeah.
which is actually, isn't it a parent-child thing?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
I mean, when you're a parent, you want your children to obey,
Yeah.
to do, want to
Yeah.
have to negotiate everything. But you don't want them to mindlessly obey. You want them to push
No.
back and ask questions, say, "Are you sure you want me to do that? Why is
Yeah.
that? What's the, what's the
Because you want the
argument?"
obedience of the heart, don't you? You
Yeah,
don't want, yeah, that's fundamental. Yeah.
yeah,
You don't just
yeah.
want you don't want you don't want somebody just to kowtow, as it were.
No, yeah,
No.
indeed, indeed. Um, Now, fascinatingly, just moving on from that bit, then we get into this language of friendship, and then we
Mm.
come circling back. Now,
Yeah.
this language of being chosen is fascinating as well, isn't it? Because actually, in the fourth gospel, Jesus never chooses people; they always come up to him.
Yeah.
And the Greeks came in chapter 12 seeking him, but suddenly then he goes back to being quite sort of synoptic, because in the synoptic gospels Jesus is always going around choosing people, and they say, "Oh,
Yeah.
me, right, okay,
Yeah.
fine,
Yeah.
I'll leave everything and come after you." And theologically we get the same thing here, don't we? You did not choose me, but I chose you. And then we get a change in register of the abiding, because
Mm.
I appointed you, I put you in place, I established you so that you should go and bear fruit. Now, hang on a minute. I thought we bore fruit by making sure that we abided in
Biden.
Jesus,
Yes.
but now it's him who's doing it all. And then the register of abiding changes, because of course abiding means remaining, and he says that the fruit that you bear will actually last, will endure. So there's another sense, another dimension to this whole abiding thing, which is fascinating.
It is extraordinary, isn't it? And I mean, I suppose the point that he's making here about choice is that given the context within the fourth gospel, that there's not a lot of choosing of disciples, no choosing of disciples or whatever,
Yeah,
that actually if you are a disciple, you have been chosen.
yeah,
There's just something reassuring about that.
yeah, yeah. There is.
But of course we have a lot of our language about relationship with Jesus is
It's about
that
us
we've
choosing.
made a choice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this subverts that quite significantly.
It does.
And I think it's a really
And I certainly
important.
find that's true for me biographically. I suppose at one point I had to make a decision, but I had
Yeah.
the sense of God simply saying, "Well, I want you to know me, and
Mm.
I'll make sure that you meet the people that will make that happen." So,
But
I
there's also a
sorry,
sense
go
in
on.
which, there's also a sense in which if you say, "Well, I'm chosen," I find that raises a puzzling question. Well, why have I been chosen?
Yeah,
And actually, that can lead to a very fruitful dialogue, it seems to me,
yes, yeah.
with the Lord, because we, yeah, it's it's not obvious.
Why me? And he says, "Well,
To be honest.
because
Yeah.
I just chose."
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Deuteronomy 7, the same question as Israel. Israel, where God says, "I didn't choose you because the greatest
Yeah.
of nations, you're the smallest. I loved you because I loved you. I loved you
Yeah.
because I decided to set my love on
Yeah.
you."
Yeah. We're
So
straight back to election, aren't
there's no particular merit, there's no particular virtue. It's just out of my
we? Mm.
heart, my love to set on you. And I
Yeah.
think that's a vital context. I mean, this is a whole big subject we won't explore in depth here, but whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give it to you. And people have all sorts of questions about saying, "Oh, well, I want a new car. Can I have that? Or I'd like a big house. Can I have that?" But of course, the whole context of this is about abiding his love, obeying his commandments,
Yeah.
and being fruitful in faith. And when you're in that place, then the things, of course, you're going to desire and ask for, are the things that are going to glorify God and, are going
Yes,
to produce
because
spiritual fruit.
absolutely, because your desire has been transformed by
Yeah,
that relationship.
indeed.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Gosh, once you start going round and around these things, there's lots and lots to say, isn't there? But
There is,
our
yeah, we could
time has
be,
come to an end, as
yes.
we've meandered around these things and stirred in the new ideas. And just to finish, a little summary point from the article, which will be on the blog as well, where I try to summarize and draw these things together. And it's in relation to the whole question of love, loving one another, loving God, loving Jesus. The goal is love, but in order to reach that goal, we need to abide in Jesus. We need to find our home in him. We need to be rooted in his teaching and obeying his commandments and allowing ourselves to be pruned, ready to lay ourselves down for others in acts of practical service, which I hope has stirred the whole mixture in together.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good.
Stick it in the oven, bake it at 190 degrees for a couple of hours, and lo and behold, something useful
Yeah.
to say.
Something will come out.
James, thank you so much. Great to chat with you, friends. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to do those 4 things. Click on the like, share it with other folk on the social media, make some comments, and subscribe. And we look forward to being with you again next week. Thanks
Mm.
very much, James. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.